Now, we also talked about how the Quran, in three separate places, speaks about and records a series of charges that were brought against it by the unbelievers or the disbelievers, where they came to Muhammad and they said, this is nothing new. These are ancient tales of the ancients. We've heard them all before. You're not bringing us anything new here, Muhammad. And the Quran responds to this by saying, no, these have been sent down. The contents have been sent down. And it responds to the charge that Muhammad was receiving his information from an advisor who the Quran says had a foreign tongue, as we read in Surah 68, verse 15. And according to the Islamic text, this was a Persian acquaintance of Muhammad. And the Quran again responds to that by saying that Muhammad's language is not Persian, it's Arabic, and therefore he could not have gotten this from this Persian informant. And the Quran goes on to point out that these ideas that the Quran has been fabricated or that it has been invented is nonsense, that it is indeed a heavenly text sent down. And then we started looking at some of these stories in the Quran, and we asked the question, well, are these stories really unique to the Quran? We looked at the story of Cain and Abel in Surah 5 and verse 31, and we saw how the story of Cain slaying his brother Abel and then learning how to bury his brother when a raven was sent. We found that this story was actually already well known to the Jews in particular, as it was found in the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah, where we have the story said that a raven was sent from God to teach Adam and Eve, in that account, how to bury and dispose of the body of Abel. And so the idea here is not original to the Quran. It clearly comes from another source centuries before the Quran was written. And there's no doubt that when Muhammad was in Medina, which had a very high Jewish population there, there's no doubt that Muhammad would have come across these stories. He would have heard of these stories. Now, we also talked a little bit about the other stories we find in the Quran. For instance, the Quran talks about the story of Abraham breaking the idols, his father's idols, and then being thrown into a fire by Nimrod, and then being delivered, as we see in Surah 21, verses 51 to 71. But this story, as interesting as it appears and as noble as it appears, was a story that was in circulation already in the Jewish communities of Arabia and other parts of the world. And the story of Abraham breaking his father's idols and then being thrown into the fire was already found in the Midrash Rabbah, which is one of the Jewish texts, along with the Mishnah and the Talmud. And in that story, we have exactly this same story being recounted about Abraham breaking his father's idols and then being thrown into the fire. The only problem, of course, when the Quran talks about Nimrod throwing Abraham into the fire, the only problem with that is we've got a historical problem, and that is Nimrod lived before Abraham. You find the story of Nimrod in Genesis 10 and 11, and he lived before Abraham, and so there's a bit of an anachronism there about Nimrod being alive in the days of Solomon. The story of Solomon and Sheba, or Suleiman in the Arabic, the story of Solomon and Sheba, as we read in Surah 27, verses 17 to 44, where Sheba comes all the way to hear Solomon, and she goes to his palace, and she travels to Solomon's palace, and we're told there that the floor of the palace was so bright, it was so shiny that she thought it was a sea of water. This story, again, was very well known. It was found already in the Targum of Esther, which was a Jewish writing. And the Targums were simply Aramaic translations or commentaries on the Old Testament. And so these Targums were already in existence prior to the Quran. And in this Targum of Esther, we have exactly the same story about Sheba coming to Solomon and how she thought the palace floor was a sea of water and so forth. The similarities are so close that this cannot be coincidence. What about the story of God raising up Mount Sinai over the heads of the Israelites? We read in Surah 7, verse 171, that Allah took Mount Sinai and he raised it over the heads of the Jews, and he threatened to destroy them if they would not obey the Torah. Well, again, this story is found in a Jewish text known as Avodah Sarah. Avodah Sarah. So once again, this story was very well known to the Jews of Muhammad's day. And the Quran also points out in Surah 7, verse 148, and Surah 20, verse 88, the making of the golden calf. When the golden calf was made in the wilderness, the Quran says that it came out of the fire and it lowed. It actually mooed. And this story, again, is not new. This was already known in a Jewish text called Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. It was a text written by Rabbi Eliezer, which he said the golden calf came out of the fire and actually lowed. Again, this was written long before the Quran, but yet the Quran has the same story in its pages. The Quran speaks about the seven heavens. Where does this come from? Well, this was very well known to the Jews. It comes from the Jewish text known as the Haggadah, and it also comes from the Zohar. The Zohar is one of the books in the Jewish Kabbalah. What about the angels and Iblis being commanded to bow down and worship Adam? Well, we saw this in the Quran, Surah 234, but this comes from the life of Adam and Eve, another one of those intertestamental texts. What about Christian sources? Does the Quran copy from Christian sources? Well, what about the story of the seven sleepers found in Surah 18? And we find there the story of these people who went into a cave and they slept for centuries. Where did the story come from? Is this unique? Well, not at all. We know this story. It was a Christian folklore. It came from the Latin work of Gregory of Tours. And Gregory of Tours wrote the text, The Seven Sleepers of Ephesus, where he recounts this story of these people going into a cave with their dog and actually sleeping for centuries and then waking up later. So once again, this is not new. Now you see, folks, what do we find here? The Quran claims to be heavenly, but yet what we find is that when we look into it and critically assess it, what we find is that the stories in there are really nothing new. So has the Quran been sent down from God, or is it of an earthly source? I think if you've been listening and if you've been analyzing the evidence for yourself, you would find that it does come from a human source. And so I hope that this information will help you, that it will challenge you, and that you would use your God-given mind to investigate these issues further and come to the realization that we need truth more than anything else. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.